There's one other rather nice feature that the two base classes, comparer of t and equality comparer of t, support. They can supply default comparers for any given type. I can show you that if we go back to our hash set and remove the parameter that tells it to use our food item equality comparer from its constructor. We know that this means it will do case-sensitive comparisons on the food item names, but suppose I do this. I've explicitly given the hash set an equality comparer, but this time I haven't given it one that I've written. Instead, I've used a property on equality comparer of t called default to supply a default equality comparer. What will that do? Let's try it. It made no difference. Supplying the default equality comparer is exactly the same as not supplying an equality comparer at all. And there's a good reason for that. Most collections have to have either an equality comparer or a comparer, depending on the collection type, to work with. The Microsoft collections really do depend massively on comparers and equality comparers. So if you don't explicitly give the collection a comparer or equality comparer, the collection will internally obtain a default one and use that. So by explicitly supplying a default comparer, you're not actually changing anything. The process is exactly the same whether you're dealing with a comparer or an equality comparer. Equality comparer of t has a default property that gives you a default equality comparer, and for comparers, comparer of t has a similar default property to give you a default comparer. So what are these default comparers and equality comparers? Well, the slide shows the situation for comparers. Default comparers are singletons that use a type's own natural comparison implementation, but wrap it in comparer semantics, so you can access the type's iComparable of t comparisons using the iComparer of t interface. And that means if you're in a situation where you need to supply a comparer, but you don't have one available, you can just use the default one instead, as long as you're willing to go with the type's own natural comparison logic. That's for comparers. Equality comparers are exactly analogous, except they deal with equality, not comparisons. Now the reason I'm telling you about default comparers and equality comparers is because if you start exploring comparers and equality comparers, you will very quickly encounter documentation that refers to the default ones, or methods that deal with the default ones. And if you don't know what they are, that can be quite confusing. But in practice, you probably won't explicitly use default comparers and equality comparers very much. They just tend to sit there under the hood most of the time that you work with collections. And just to be clear, you never need to write default comparers yourself. There's some very clever code in the comparer of t-base type which can analyze any other type and create an appropriate default comparer for that type. And that's why you get the default comparer through comparer of t's default property. And it's basically the same for equality comparers.